G'day everyone, and welcome to Lubrication Explained. In this video, we are going to discuss engine oil specifications, specifically what they're for and what they're trying to achieve. So we'll try and put them in some historical context and talk about them in the context of other developments with OEMs and manufacturers, and we'll try and piece this all together. So if we were to put a bit of a timeline on a page, let's say from about early 2000s through to approximately the present, what we'd see is that there have been many developments, both in, let's say, for example, passenger vehicles. So we have the ILSAC GF specifications, GF4, 5 and 6. Then we've got the API Class C specifications as well. So these relate to diesel engines. You'll probably be familiar with CI4, CJ4, CK4. And those there are the predominant, if you like, American specifications that a lot of the American manufacturers are going to adhere to. But we also have different regulatory regimes around the world. And of course, there are many different engine manufacturers from different countries. So predominantly you've got the US, but there is also Japan, for example, with their JASO specs. And in Europe, we've got the ACEA specs, so ACEA 2 through to 17, and they're generally based on the year that they were released. Now, those are the engine oil specifications. Simultaneously, though, what you have are a whole set of regulations around emissions. So you'd be familiar, for example, with engines being advertised as Euro 6 compliant. Well, that's more an emission regulation rather than engine oil spec. But the two kind of go hand in hand. And if you had to talk about, regimes and what these different specifications are trying to achieve, the early 2000s through to 2010s was all about emission controls. And we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, but it's around reducing things like NOx and particulate matter. From sort of 2012 onwards, we move into a fuel efficiency regime where it's all about trying to reduce CO2 emissions. So emissions control is a really good one to explore. So if I had two axes and I was able to say that one of them is NOx and the other one is particulate matter, what we've effectively done is gone from the old CG4 specs and steadily reduced the amount of acceptable NOx and particulate matter with each generation of engine oil. And here I'm specifically talking to the API C-class diesel engine oil specs. We have, of course, moved on to CK4, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. So if you were to put them in historical context, this change occurred over a period of about 16 years. And what we were able to achieve is huge reductions in emissions. So if you look on the y-axis, for example, NOx on a unit basis has been reduced from 5 grams per horsepower hour down to about 0.2. That decrease exceeds 95%. So that's massive. And we have similar gains in the particulate matter area. Now, these gains have gone on with other technological improvements. For example, in the mid-90s, we had changes to piston design, which helped with emissions control, and as well as combustion control. So these really helped with the completeness, if you like, of the combustion, which meant that there was a lot less uncombusted fuel ending up in the exhaust system. From the early 2000s, we got into exhaust gas recirculation. And then in the mid-2000s, we started to see, things like DPFs or diesel particulate filters become really common. And they're a, exhaust treatment system. At the same time, we had changes to fuel regulations. So in the US, we went from 500 parts per million sulfur being acceptable right down to 15 parts per million sulfur. And again, that is a huge step change when it comes to the quality of the fuel as well. So all of these things kind of went together to help reduce both NOx and particulate matter. But if you look at it over the course of those 15 years, those gains are absolutely massive, and you start to reach that kind of law of diminishing returns. So we're going to put in a lot more effort in the next generation of engine oil to maybe gain us a tiny little bit of extra NOx performance. It felt like there were gains to be made elsewhere. And this is where you get into a different kind of emissions control, where from this point onwards, we wanted to control carbon dioxide emissions. Now, the reality is, if you want to control carbon dioxide emissions, what you're really talking about is fuel efficiency. So you're reducing the amount of fuel that is burnt, and therefore the amount of carbon dioxide that comes out of the tailpipe. So if we were to look at the, if you like, fuel efficiency of different classes of vehicles in the US by year, what we can see is that there's some pretty definite changes over time. So for people who are around in the 70s, you'll probably remember the oil shock. There was a period of sustained high oil prices and uncertainty. That was due to some global conflicts. And that really pushed engine OEMs to make huge gains in miles per gallon ratings on cars, trucks, buses, etc. But after that, what we saw is a sustained period of stable oil prices, and the focus on fuel efficiency, it kind of took a back seat. From around 2011 onwards, changes to regulatory environments, as well as maybe changing sentiment towards climate change, resulted in an age where we desired better fuel efficiency. And this is where, if you were to look at the C-Class diesel engine oil specifications, this is when you start to get into the CK4, FA4 age in 2016. So how do we improve fuel efficiency in an engine? Well, there's really only a couple of ways. You can reduce the viscosity, and you can reduce the internal friction of the lubricant. So reducing viscosity comes in two forms. There's a trend towards lower SAE grades. So where a diesel engine oil typically would have been a 15W40, we're now starting to see factory fill with 10W40, 10W30, and even some synthetic 5W30s. In a similar way with passenger vehicles, 0W20s are now becoming relatively normal, and there is a new SAE standard, which is 0W16. At the same time, we're also seeing lower high temperature, high shear ratings as well. And we'll talk a bit about that in its own standalone video, because that requires some more detail. We also have the capacity to reduce the internal friction of the lubricant, which I've talked about, and I'll link that video separately. And that's really a driving force behind synthetic lubricants, because we can achieve fuel efficiencies by moving to synthetic lubricants. Now, you can't just reduce the viscosity of a lubricant without adjusting other factors, right? So a lower SAE grade lubricant may run you into problems when it comes to things like cam and cam follower wear, or the drive gears. So what that necessitates is an improvement to the anti-wear performance of the oil. But you can't just throw more ZDDP into the formulation, because we have requirements around reducing the amount of zinc and phosphorus to ensure that we don't poison the catalysts, because we still have emissions regulations. So this is where the trade-off in engine oil formulations has really driven formulators and driven the additive technologies to get better and better. So I hope that this has been an informative video for you. I'll be doing more detailed videos, for example, on CK4, FA4 in future. But for the moment, this has been Lubrication Explained.